Hello, welcome everyone to the IHR Latin American History Seminar. I'm Tom Raff, I'm one of the conveners of the seminar. I'm very pleased to welcome our speaker for this evening, Benjamin T. Smith, who is a professor of history at Warwick University. For those of us interested in modern Mexican history, increasingly Ben doesn't really need any introduction. He's the author of numerous works in the social, political history of Mexico, including most recently, well, a few years ago, an award-winning New History of the Press since the 1940s. And even more recently than that, the book of The Dope, The Real History of the Mexican Drug Trade, published by Norton, which came out just last year. So I think Ben is going to be drawing on some of that new research on the drug history for the paper this evening. In his abstract for this talk, Ben said that he's not going to be entertaining. I'm skeptical of that because I've heard Ben speak lots of times and it's always been quite engaging and also rather entertaining. So I think that was mainly a dig at maybe other disciplines rather than a realistic thing that's going to happen this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ben. And Ben, if you want to get started, and I'll try and get your PowerPoint up as you begin.
Okay, thank you very much. It's more of a dig of my my partial co-author, Tom Long, who also helped me write this paper. Okay, so I'll start off then. So the title of this talk is Arbiters of Impunity, Agents of Coercion, State Crime and Violence in Mexico. So the former Mexican police chief, Genaro Garcia Luna, currently awaits trial in the United States. He was head of both the AFI and the Secretary of Public Security, but he's accused of accepting millions of dollars in bribes to protect members of the Sinaloa cartel. Now, this was never meant to be. For over a decade, Garcia Luna was lauded as the country's best cop. He pioneered big data policing in Mexico. I'm sorry, that has...
No, that's not working.
Don't worry too much. I'm not...
Got it, here we go.
PowerPoint. There we go. So it's the next one, if that's all right. So Garcia Luna pioneered big data policing. He instituted a state-of-the-art surveillance bunker under Mexico City. In the US, he was the dependable drug warrior, easy to get on with, friendly to American agents, and responsible for dozens of high-profile arrests. He was so close to the DEA that he used his connections to retire to Florida in 2012. So the question is, what went wrong? Since Garcia Luna's arrest, both US and Mexican commentators have answered with one voice: corruption. Drug dollars and Mexican moral failings have combined once again to scupper the proper pursuit of the war on drugs. Now, this paper argues that such commentators are wrong, or at least overly simplistic. Garcia Luna does not represent just another in a long line of corrupt Mexican cops, another drug war cliche. Garcia Luna was an expert state builder, a constructor of bulky modern security institutions. He was also a drug warrior whose big cases and high-profile raids put away thousands of drug traffickers. But to be good at both of these, he also, by necessity, had to be embroiled with drug cash, criminal actors, and illicit protection rackets. Furthermore, so did his predecessors. Now, the reasons why, which I'm going to lay out in this paper, suggest the duality at the heart of the Mexican state, the paradox at the heart of America's war on drugs, and the deep-rooted causes of Mexico's contemporary violence. This is a fairly ambitious paper, as you can see. Right, so since 2007, if you can go to the next slide, Tom. Since 2007, increasing homicide rates have drawn attention to the connections among crime, violence, and the state. While most analysts agree the state actors are intertwined with crime and violence, there is little consensus about how and why. For some, the Mexican state is fragmented and weak, even failed. For others, the state is strong, murderous, and unchecked. Violence results from the policy of choices of a cohesive state. A third group sees the state that may possess adequate capacities, but is so riddled by corruption, it cannot properly deploy them. Now, this debate about the Mexican state has its echoes in the historiography. Many still view the post-revolutionary state as strong, unified under the control of a single party and controlled by presidents who were given exceedingly broad constitutional authority. Others, in contrast, have stressed the state's weakness, its limited ability to extract resources, its inadequate bureaucracy, its small military, and its overriding concern with stability over control. Now, how to reconcile these visions? And how can we place debates about the state and criminal violence today in the context of debates on the historical nature of Mexico's state. In short, I argue in this paper, by combining literature on state formation with literature on organized crime. Now, to do so, I've turned to the work of Charles Tilly, who famously compared the state to a protection racket and state making to organized crime. If we can have the next slide, that'd be great. Scholars have used these insights in two divergent ways. On the one hand, the historians of the state. They have used Tilly's insights to describe how wars, or the threats of wars, have built up states. On the other hand, there are scholars of organized crime who've used Tilly's insights to understand how criminal groups like the mafia or rebel groups like Colombia's FARC have offered protection and de facto governance to entrepreneurs when the state fails to do so. Now, combining these literatures, I make a slightly different point, that in many states, and especially those with access to transnational illicit markets, the state is not one protection racket, but two. Now, both of these protection rackets, at their core, are combinations of coercion and its extraction. One is what I call the licit racket, which, like Tilly's state, demands tax from businesses and citizens in return for legal regulation. The other, however, is an illicit racket, which, like the mafia, demands bribes or kickbacks from criminals in return for protection. Now, these two rackets are mutually dependent. The owners of the licit racket offers the managers of the illicit racket impunity from prosecution for receiving these bribes. As a result, I call them the arbiters of impunity. In return, the managers of the illicit racket offer the licit racket owners the use of force against potential rivals. Hence, I call them the agents of coercion. These two rackets then allow the state to overcome fundamental weaknesses, namely insufficient resources and inadequate coercive capacity. Two little sub-arguments buttress this central assertion. The first concerns the nature of corruption. I argue that though the practices of illicit protection rackets are often dismissed as corruption, they actually fulfill a rather distinct state-building role. At least some of the bribes have and still are used to fulfill the functions of the state, ranging from coercing rivals to funding legitimacy-enhancing goods. The second argument concerns the relationship between the illicit protection racket and the transnational drug trade. Any high-value commodity can generate an illicit racket, but a century of internationally enforced drug prohibition has produced particularly strong incentives. These in turn have spawned particularly stable and enduring protection schemes, as well as the ones that have proved very difficult to dismantle. So if you can go to the next slide, that'd be great. So the first kind of 10 minutes, or you're going to have to kind of, click it a couple of times, I'm afraid, Tom. Right, sorry, that's a bit of a mess. For that, I apologize. So first off, then, the theory, the licit face of the state. Now, in my model of state duality, the state's licit face resembles Tilly's conceptualization, really, of the state. Tilly argued that the fundamental functions of the state, security and extraction, operated like a protection racket. The state exacted tributes or taxes for the provision of security against both state rivals and itself. You pay tax or you get stuck in jail. However, many states, I argue, have another illicit face. Now, formally, licit states that aim for international legitimacy cannot practice resource extraction from illicit economies. In short, they're not allowed to formally tax drugs. Yet illicit economies offer huge potential resources. They also offer some dangers. Political rivals, for example, could exploit these lucrative rackets and pose a frontal challenge to the power of the state. In actual fact, for example, the FARC did this. It taxed cocaine growers and challenged the Colombian state. So in certain circumstances, the state opens up, I argue, a second sub rosa track of state building, using extortion and protection of these illicit economies to extract resources. Because the licit state cannot tap these markets openly, it uses its authority and economic weight to offer impunity to certain semi-autonomous state agents to do so. Okay, now these two protection rackets, and if I could have the next slide, that'd be great. Next one. And again, yep. And one more. Brilliant. See, it's so political science. I've even got a diagram. So these two protection rackets are interwoven and interdependent, two sides of a single but Janus-faced state. They're held together above all by the exchange of impunity for resources and coercion. While the owners of the licit state may lack a monopoly over the legitimate use of violence, they exercise a monopoly over the conferral of impunity. By excluding certain actors from selective enforcement of the law, impunity acts as a political currency that binds the agents of coercion to the state. I.e., you can get away, as long as you remain loyal, the state will let you off doing what you do. Security experts often dismiss the state's relations to illicit protection rackets as corruption, another way to enrich the dominant class. Now, no doubt this happens. It's frequent. But over the past 2 decades, most scholars of corruption have moved beyond this one-size-fits-all definition of the practice. They now see corruption as both socially constructed and culturally contextualized. Following such insights, in this Janus-faced state, corruption plays an integral state-making role. The funds from the illicit racket are used for core functions. This can be anything from building roads to establishing schools. But these funds usually end up funding the state's security apparatus, the military and the police, to buttress the means of selective enforcement. The same actors not only extort, they eliminate rivals to the licit state. Now, this exchange of impunity for coercion explicitly relies on the state's legal framework and international position. It is this that prevents the terms of this agreement tipping out into some kind of Hobbesian free-for-all and keeps the agents of coercion in line. The state offers impunity to agents of coercion, but only if they do the state's bidding efficiently and relatively covertly. If not, they can be prosecuted, extradited, and even handed over to the international authorities. So my next question is, and you'll be relieved to know that the theoretical bit is almost over, and I'll be back onto history in about 5 minutes. Anyway, all states. Can we have the next slide, please, Tom? And you'll have to flick through this a bit. Right, here we are. That's it. All states, to an certain extent, start off as weak, fragmented, and reliant on local power brokers. Most, however, eventually manage to subordinate and tax these power brokers. In Tilley's model, knights became courtiers. In many developing countries, however, this tipping point, this complete subordination of lower local power brokers never really happens. So the question is, why? Here it's worth looking at the criminology literature on mafia protection rackets. Now, this literature explains how private protection rackets emerged when the state is unable to provide protection to high value licit products. So these were like oranges in 19th century Sicily or private property in post-Glasnost Russia. They suggest that the protection rackets gradually disappear as booms run down, and those running them seek more formal and less violent protection from the state. So, for example, Vadim Volkov argues that in Russia, in the late 1990s, the wealthiest violence entrepreneurs started to demand more orderly business environments. So they negotiated basically with the state to go legit. They became businessmen. And Vladimir Putin, in an effort to collect more taxes and build the state, let them. Or in terms of our own model, the licit protection racket effectively swallowed the illicit one. So if in some countries these illicit protection rackets wither and then die, why in others do they persist? The key, we argue, is the international prohibition of the product being protected. Most licit commodity booms have a finite lifespan, and those extracting protection for these products seek more formal security for their wealth. One product, however, is in a state of almost perpetual boom because international pressures make it difficult for those involved to ever go legit. The product is narcotics. Though tastes for individual drugs have risen and fallen, the Western and particularly the US demand for some kind of narcotic stimulant has remained relatively constant throughout the 20th century. Furthermore, counter-narcotic efforts have counterproductively cemented the high value of these products. However, moreover, international counter-narcotics pressures to keep drugs illegal maintains the low interpersonal trust between those dealing in the products. As there's no legal regulation for drug dealing, those involved fear being scammed by other traffickers. Punishments for drug trafficking are also harsh, so traffickers and producers fear being caught. Together, these dynamics sustain the constant need for protection. The result, then, of this theory is a state that does not fit neatly on a continuum of state strength or weakness. The state possesses extensive coercive capabilities, but they're disaggregated and they're formally pretty underfunded. Because the state's own agents of coercion are largely self-funding, they retain considerable, though incomplete, autonomy from the dominant class. Yet their illicit racket relies on the state's legal framework for its value, operation, and even existence. Right, so there's the theory that I'm sure I've bored with you if you haven't left yet. I'm now going to spend hopefully another kind of 10, 15 minutes going through why Mexico, you can apply this model to Mexico and it fits rather well. And then I'll end with some kind of more general discussions over Latin American and other global South states. Mexico's 20th century history then provides a useful case study for illustrating the emergence and the endurance of these intertwined protection rackets. Can I have the next slide, if that's all right, Tom? Like any state that emerged from a prolonged period of civil strife, post-revolutionary Mexico faced two essential problems. Is that, yeah, that should be the next slide. So post-revolutionary Mexico faced two problems, money and security. Since the revolution of 1910, the Mexican state has collected extremely low taxes in both actual and comparative terms. In 1965, taxes as a proportion of gross domestic product stood at 10%. This was last among all the countries of Latin America, around the level of Violencia-era Colombia or Guatemala. Over the past half century, things have not improved. Taxes remain extremely low, just over 16%. In short, the traditional state-building pact outlined by Tilly, where the expanding state offers better protection in return for more money, has found its match in Mexico's obstinate tax-evading elites. Low tax, then, has restricted state capacity. Despite its revolutionary heritage and promise of extensive social rights, the cash-strapped Mexican state has remained both small and financially restricted. Numbers of state employees have remained low, and today Mexico's government expenditure as a percentage of GDP remains 10% less than the Latin American average. Mexico's licit protection racket then was, and still is, limited. This in turn has restricted the state's other principal concern, security. Though the Federal Army managed to put down the revolts immediately following the revolution, it often had to rely on irregular local power brokers, caciques, if you will, and it struggled to extend control to the country's bolshy, independent-minded provincial cities or the remote mountainous regions that split the country in two. As a result, many political groups remained relatively autonomous. The central state in the post-revolutionary era, then, was at an impasse. It lacked the requisite force to ensure security and order, which allowed potential rivals to the state to remain firmly entrenched. In turn, the state was unable to effectively demand protection tributes. To break this logjam, then, I would argue the state offered something valuable, but also in effect free, and that was impunity. This, not nobility, as Tilly suggested for medieval Europe, was the essential political and social currency of post-revolutionary politics. It is not, for example, the pre-badge that gives Juan Vargas status in the black comedy La Ley de Errores. It is, as the pre-governor tells him, a book of laws and a gun. As Pablo Picato asserts then, impunity became a keystone of a system in which the state lacked the monopoly of legitimate use of violence, yet maintained the appearance of an unlimited ability to use it. Or, to rephrase Weber, the state did not so much have a monopoly of the legitimate use of force as a monopoly over the proffering of official impunity. There were both general and more targeted mechanisms of proffering impunity. The links between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary were extremely close, allowing the executive to play a decisive role in knotty judicial matters. Because the press was relatively tightly controlled, these interventions remained open secrets, and when journalists did openly discuss protection rackets, they tended to end up in prison, beaten, or dead. But there were also more refined tools of employing impunity. Though jury trials had been scrapped in 1929 for criminal cases, they remained for politicians or bureaucrats accused of corruption. Yet the jury in these cases was not a random selection of citizens. It was a selection of representatives drawn from the ruling party, the PRI. Guilty verdicts were, as a result, as you could expect, rare. This impunity then had different levels. As Picato writes, there was impunity for murder, particularly if it furthered state aims. But the impunity the state favoured, and which really intertwined with its aims, was the impunity for running protection rackets for the producers of illicit goods. The managers of these rackets, the governors, the cops, the army generals, would offer producers and traffickers protection for a cut of the profits. And in return for impunity, the managers of these rackets would do the state's bidding. It was win-win. The local power brokers got money, the federal government got loyal but eminently disposable agents of coercion, and they did so without spending any cash. So in the first 20 years following the revolution, so 1920 to 1940, and if we could have the next slide, that would be great. The principal managers of these protection rackets were local caciques, generals, mayors, and local cops. Illicit industries included illegal logging, illegal mining, illegal still running, booze smuggling, gambling, prostitution, and both the domestic and transnational narcotics businesses. Now, if these kind of protection rackets were omnipresent, they were concentrated at the border, where local politicians vied for the protection of 5 interlinking industries: alcohol, human smuggling, prostitution, gambling, and narcotics. In the bigger cities, more prominent politicians struggled for the protection rackets. They included generals like General Jose Alvarez, who protected Ciudad Juarez's legendary Tivoli casino in the early 1930s, or the mayor Agustin Gallo, who protected the Chinese opium joints, counterfeiters, and booze runners, again in the 1930s. However, with the end of alcohol prohibition in 1933 and the gradual drying up of European and Asian sources of opiates in the second half of the 1930s, the most profitable of these protection rackets became over narcotics. At first, the principal products were morphine and smoking opium, but by the 1960s, they extended to marijuana, and by the 1970s, heroin and cocaine. The narcotics business, more than booze or sex workers or illegal mining, proved a kind of perfect steady object for these types of protection rackets. Like a prolonged version of the citrus boom that birthed the Sicilian mafia, the drug trade offered unrelenting demand and resources for Mexico's illicit protection rackets. US counter-narcotics policies also ensured demand for protection by undermining interpersonal trust. Faced with the threat of betrayal, US-run informants, long jail terms, or even extradition, traffickers were always prepared to pay protectors good money. Now, up until the 1970s, the most important protectors of the drug trade were the state governors. The earliest of these state protectors was that Mexico's kind of mafiosi was Esteban Cantu, the governor of Baja California from 1915 to 1920. And if I could have the next slide here, Tom. With Mexico's anti-drug laws still unclear, initially, Esteban Cantu attempted to bring drug producers into the licit protection racket. Next one if possible. In 1915, he published 3 decrees which regulated and taxed the trade. However, after the government of California issued an official complaint, he cancelled the edicts and instead established Mexico's first illicit drug protection racket. According to the US customs agent who visited the state a year later, it worked as follows. A select group of Chinese importers brought opium into the port of Ensenada. They handed the opium to a group of local businessmen who paid off the port authorities, and also Cantu's representatives. They then split the opium into 2 parts. One was delivered to a domestic opium dens in Mexicali. The rest was shipped to the Chinese in San Francisco. The gang was rumored to pay Cantu around $11,000 per month for the concession. Now, over the past century, such arrangements have often been dismissed as corruption. But in reality, Cantu's system also allowed us to perceive the other side of these illicit protection rackets, their ability to provide security and finances at a minimal cost, their ability, in short, to build up the state on the cheap. Cantu's earnings from the drug protection racket helped the government become one of the richest in Mexico. Cantu also spent the money wisely. He brought security by increasing police and military forces and using them to track down bandits. He built roads all over the peninsula. He dotted the towns and villages with primaries and secondaries and gave scholarships to deserving children. He introduced drinkable water and garbage collection and even paid government workers US-level wages. Now, Cantu does seem to have been exceptionally honest, but he was not alone. And throughout the period, and particularly when the drug trade really took off in the 1940s, many governors took Cantu's approach. Constrained by international and particularly US counter-narcotics efforts, they supplemented licit taxes with finances from illicit protection rackets. And I'm happy to go into other examples I have, but for questions of time, I then want to move on quickly. During the 1970s, however, things changed. Next slide, if possible. It was the Cold War, and the Mexican state was beset by increasing rivals from across the political spectrum. Fearing these rivals could tap the expanding illicit drug markets, the federal authorities sought monopoly control over the provision of impunity. How did they do this? Well, they basically sent federal agencies to lever out the local police and manage the illicit protection rackets themselves. Protection rackets, the illicit face of the state, basically went federal. This was, and still is, seen by many historians simply as corruption again, but it was corruption at the service of the state, albeit a state that was now much more violent and predatory than before. This was most obvious in the southern state of Guerrero, where the Mexican military fought a brutal war, first against the Asociación Cívica Nacional Revolucionaria, and then against the Partido de los Pobres. Now, to do this, it extracted money and labor from local marijuana and opium producers in exchange for protection, and it employed the traffickers as deniable assets to take on radical groups. From 1974 onwards, for example, the army offered protection to a paramilitary organization from Acapulco called Grupo Sangre, or the Group Blood. The organization tracked down suspected guerrillas, tortured them for information, and then murdered them. It was made up of marijuana and opium growers who basically got protection in order for doing the state's bidding. Those in charge of the protection rackets then shifted throughout the 1970s. Now, first, it seems to have been the military, then by the mid-1970s, the Policía Judicial, or the PJF, and then by the 1980s, the Secret Service, or the Dirección Federal de Seguridad. But the deal was the same. They offered criminals protection in return for money or labor. The money or labor was then used to fight the dirty war. In fact, these schemes were so profitable that by the mid-1980s, there were rumors that ministry in charge of the DFS had refused a formal budget. In fact, profits from the illicit drug trafficking sufficed to fund it. Throughout this period, some agents of coercion did accrue so much personal wealth and corresponding power that they threatened the stability of the system. At this point, Mexico's arbiters of impunity revoked the offer of impunity, joined in accusations of corruption, and allowed the Americans to act as the country's de facto police. In 1983, for example, Arturo El Negro Durazo, the former head of Mexico City Police, dreamed up a plan to assassinate the sitting president, Miguel de la Madrid. At this point, the Mexican authorities made good on their promises of moral reform. They leaked proof of Durazo's corruption and offered intel on him to the FBI and Interpol. These then tracked him down the wayward cop to Puerto Rico, handed him to the Mexicans, who promptly imprisoned him. But such incidents then were blips, which Mexico's arbiters were able to ride out. And soon the system returned. By the late 1980s, official control seems to have reverted to the PJF. Under President Carlos Salinas, Guillermo González Calderón was in charge. He used his influence to secure payment from the country's increasingly powerful cocaine traffickers. Again, no doubt González made a lot of money out of this arrangement, but he also used this money to build up the PJF, and he used it to take out rivals to Salinas from the up-and-coming left-wing party, the PRD. In 1993, however, González fled to the US. In a first-time move for the Mexican authorities, they actually tried to extradite him for corruption. He had broken the rules of the game. Impunity was revoked. He had started to reveal the system of protection rackets to the US government and the US public. His extraordinary explicit interview on PBS laid out in quite clear terms the relationship between these official protection rackets and the process of institution building. It's worth quoting it at some length, and I apologize for this. This is a quote from González Calderón. So the PBS asks him, "Why are so many Mexican police commanders corrupt?" And Calderón replies, "What did you do to turn them into real police officers? Did you give them a budget? Did you give them gas for their trucks? Did you give them better weapons, trucks, vehicles, intelligence, information, technology than the traffickers had? If you didn't give them any of this, really, what did you give them? You sent them off to become what they became, to take money from drug traffickers in order to fight them. Maybe they take the money from some of the traffickers to fight the other traffickers." A summary, if you like, of what I've really this entire paper is about. If I can have the next slide, please. During the 1990s, multiple economic and political changes upset the traditional system. On the domestic front, there was democratization. And between 1989 and 2000, rival political parties won the governorships of Baja California, Chihuahua, and Michoacán. By the middle of the decade, the PAN also controlled over 200 municipalities, like the big border cities of Tijuana and Juarez. These victories cut into the PRI's monopoly over the issuing of impunity. Other political parties can now question this impunity. They could have their local police forces arrest corrupt officials, and they could offer their own internal, localized certificates of impunity. This in turn broke up the increasingly valuable protection rackets. Conflicts increasingly pitched diffuse agents of coercion, often in league with traffickers, against one another. There were also waves of neoliberal restructuring. These had two effects on the system. First, reforms introduced during the 80s and 90s privatized the state's publicly run companies. This culminated in 92, when President Salinas allowed the private sale of ejido lands. Without what Haber terms the credible commitment to property rights, the rapid shift from state to private ownership offered an array of new products that needed protection. While the situation never approached the kind of legal free-for-all that crippled Russia, it expanded the ambit of the protection rackets. It wasn't just drug traffickers that paid for protection, it was the owners of farms, mines, and construction companies, avocado farmers, and lime farmers. So this expansion then and deepening of the protection racket was reflected in the language. Previously, the police had charged drug traffickers what they called the derecho de piso, the right to traffic through a specific zone. By the early 2000s, the term had expanded to refer to the bribes paid by an array of entrepreneurs to state and non-state thugs for permission to operate. It was the Mexican equivalent of the Sicilian term piso or the Russian term krisha or roof, both the terms used to basically term protection in these particular countries. Finally, I want to just come to some conclusions. So if we can have the last slide, Tom. Sorry about doing this. So my conclusions then. So this article has argued that in order to understand how crime and illicit markets affect the process of state formation, it's necessary to conceive of the state as operating not one, but two protection rackets. One does the rather orthodox task of extracting tax in return for protection, yet it's often underpowered. Thus, to fund the coercive mechanisms of government, the state also runs an off-the-books illicit protection racket. This protects illicit markets in return for cash and or labour. These two protection rackets rely on one another to build the state and exclude its rivals at a low cost to elites. The licit protection racket offers the illicit one impunity from domestic and international prosecution. The illicit one offers the licit one protection, in eminently deniable agents of coercion, muscle, if you like. I've laid out this thesis then by referring directly to the development of the Mexican state during the 20th century. And in doing so, I've attempted to question political science and historical appreciations of the state, which view it as weak, strong, or utterly undermined by corruption. I would also suggest that the drug war of the past 15 years is not so much a conflict between the state, whether weak or strong, and a rapidly expanding network of cartels, or between cartels over drugs, but between diffuse competing alliances seeking to dominate the provision of protection and the conferral of impunity. However, this vision of state formation does not simply apply to Mexico. Other developing nations, particularly during the Cold War, developed similar Janus-faced states, which funded repression with money and labor extorted from illicit markets. In the Americas, there's Brazil, where the military funded its death squads by extorting the gambling networks during the 70s and 80s. Beyond the Americas, there's Indonesia, where General Suharto teamed up with local primans or gangsters, which became, and I quote, necessary components in the maintenance of state power and the collection of taxes. But the most obvious parallel then is Colombia, partly because in Colombia, initially, this dual state failed. Here, at least initially, the state failed to monopolize the illicit rackets. And what happened? Rival groups like the FARC profited from them and threatened the state. In later years, however, the Colombians got in on the game. Successive governments offered impunity to drug-funded militias like the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia to wage a brutal campaign against FARC rivals. This model also, and I wanted to end with this, overlaps with discussions about the relationship between violence and democratization. Enrique Arias and Daniel Goldstein, as I'm sure many of you have read, provocatively argue that introducing free voting at the same time as neoliberal state-slashing reforms pushed political parties into shifting alliances with criminal groups. As a result, violence has now become embedded in the practice of Latin America's new democracies. In fact, Arias and Goldstein suggest that we should rather term them violent pluralisms. Now, I too acknowledge the overlap, especially in Latin America, between democratization and violence. However, I would suggest the roots lie in the historical traditions of state-making, not with democratization. In particular, I would suggest the narcotics trade demands an almost permanent protection from those running the state's protection rackets, while democratization inserts more actors competing to monopolize impunity and by extension the rackets. Neoliberal reforms extend these protection rackets to new vulnerable industries and products. Okay, as I promised, it was not entertaining. Please ask me entertaining questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ben. Okay, we've got a few questions to begin with. Daniel, why don't you start?
Thank you very much for your presentation, Ben. My question is, looking at these sort of Janus-faced states, is there a way for them to, looking forward, move out of this need to rely on licit and illicit forms of state building? Is there ever a way for them to leave that behind? Or is it a self-perpetuating issue that the more you use illicit sources, illicit forces to be the state's coercive arm, the more you promote those illicit sources because they realize there's the possibility of government support. There is lucrative business to be done here.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I mean, so I mean, we have got some fairly good examples of states who have managed to kind of, as I say, Russia has to a certain extent managed to swallow its illicit economy. If you remember in the kind of late 1990s, there was the growth of these kind of mafia groups that protected basically these kind of newly emergent private industries. However, eventually these mafia groups wanted to go legit, and so basically Putin legitimized them and started taking tax from them and built the state on top of that. It's really difficult to do, I mean, when the subject are drugs, because the Americans simply will not let these people go legit. I mean, I think there's a fair amount of evidence we now have that a lot of the major capos or kingpins in Mexico are also, legal businessmen. I mean, when I was in Culiacan, I was told that the milk I was drinking came from El Mayo's pasteurized milk factory, which apparently just outside the town pasteurizes milk for all of Culiacan. Not the only white thing that he deals in, but he. So, I mean, I think lots of people would go legit, but if you've got the Americans, peering over your shoulder, saying you can't do this, it's really difficult to kind of incorporate the illicit face of the state into the licit one and just charge them taxes for their pasteurized milk factory.
Thank you.
It all comes down to cows, doesn't it, Tom? In the end of the day, they'd only got into the licit cow market.
Well, yeah. Cardenas had a dairy farm as well. I'm just saying. Anyway, let me read. Paolo, do you want to read your question, or shall I read it for you?
Hi, sorry, I'm in the middle of cooking duties. So the question I had was about this idea of the state preferring impunity, and I just wondered. I mean, if it can do that, and if that impunity is so valuable that it's sought, doesn't that suggest that the state is strong in some ways after all? I mean, if impunity is the commodity that the state trades in, then that might be a pretty valuable commodity after all. And if it's the state that is the sole producer, if you like, then.
So if that's a really good question. Oh God, that's why I like to come to these. That's an excellent question. So effectively, impunity implies that the state at some point has a decent stick to hit you with.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose really cynically, what it has is lots of other people it can basically offer impunity to. If it wants to go after, I don't know, Negro Durazo for doing something, it can offer other groups the impunity, this kind of valuable impunity to do so. I suppose when you have one impunity giving power, which you kind of do under the PRI, this makes this slightly simple. I mean, one of the fundamental problems we have is that justice has become or particularly the prosecution of corruption has become utterly politicized over the last 2 decades. So pretty much every local government is offering their own kind of impunity to their own agents, right? So that has become particularly difficult. So it was kind of doable under the PRI, despite a lack of orthodox coercion, basically because it could offer its other groups the ability to. I mean, it was always really good at divide and rule, right? I'm not sure I've answered your question. It's a very good one that I'm going to have to sit down and think about slightly slow. Sorry.
I think can I come in on that? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I thought it was because it's sort of similar question to the one I had. Great minds and all that. No, I mean, I just think when you say impunity's free, I think what I was going to say, it may be cheap in some ways, but there's got to be some credible. It can't be totally costless in political terms, right? There has to be some credible threat of, renouncing impunity. So
yes, that is true. But I suppose to a certain extent, the post-revolutionary state from time to time would do this with kind of out of order groups, but it would normally do this, not necessarily, occasionally it would send in the army, but it would often send in the kind of local cacique or the agraristas from down the road.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I've necessarily.
I think that links to another question I had, but I want to hold back for a bit. Bill, you had a question as well.
Hi Ben, that was a really compelling way of framing the state, I thought, and I think it's got applicability way beyond Latin America. I mean, I think, you know, we can look around ourselves 2022 where we are right now and think about how this works for us. But in terms of Mexico, because it's such a interesting thesis on how the state works, do you think that the Mexican population has thought about the state in that way as something that is divided between licit and illicit, and whether that makes sense at a kind of vernacular level? Sorry, there's 3 small people here who are all very excited to see you.
Right. So it's a really good question. I think the clear difference is the difference between is the kind of, the police are roundly less trust. The police being the people who are broadly in charge of these illicit protection rackets for an enormous quantity of time. They're always the least popular. On any survey from about the 1960s onwards, they're always the least popular. They're always deemed to be way more corrupt than the rest. So there's that kind of. But in terms of how they kind of frame them, I'm not sure that distinction is made. It's a really, really good question, and one that I'm not sure I can necessarily offer. In terms of how people view it. Right, this is good. I'm very glad that you've got your 3 children to come here and see me get stumped by your question, Bill.
That's got me thinking. I've got we've got another couple of questions in the chat, so should we go to those now? Charlotte Crabtree asks, what about impunity of Mexican presidents themselves? What do you make of López Obrador's failed referendum last year on prosecuting his predecessors?
My thinking on that is I think this has been, the proffering of impunity, and impunity at a really high level, has had an enormous effect on the Mexican judicial system. It's impossible to quantify. The fact that they really haven't gone after any of the really big corrupt people. They've got about 5 I suppose they have got 5 governors in prison now, I think, more or less. So Duarte, a couple of them are still on the run, like Yarrington. But previously, it was incredibly rare that officials, let alone presidents, were put in power. So the higher you got, the more likely you were to enjoy impunity. I suppose it starts really with, when they tried to prosecute Echeverria, and it was at 2002, 2003, which completely failed. So I had no doubt really that AMLO's attempt to do this would also fail. But I think it is sad for the kind of judicial system as a whole, because I think putting away people with considerable power like this would undermine the way that impunity is used as currency within Mexico.
Okay, Dudley Ankerson, do you want to come in with a question? I think you'll have to unmute yourself, Dudley.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. The situation as it is now, where I would calculate at least 2/3 of the country is actually de facto not under government control in real terms. Who do the population fear most, in other words? And the answer is not the government. And therefore, there's been a fragmentation of this, and the ability of the government to offer impunity is severely weakened. And if you look at what happened with the Culiacanazo a couple of years ago, where does real power reside in Mexico now, would you say? I mean, across the country as a whole, very fragmented, local groups. It's almost reverting to the 1920s. It's not, I mean, I wouldn't go that far, not at all, obviously, but in terms of the dilution of state power, it seems to me it is quite striking over the last 5-10 years, but particularly over the last 2 or 3 years with the abrazos, no balazos policy, which has given organized crime basically a free hand.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with this. So the way that I didn't kind of in the article itself, I kind of move on to the present day and talk a little bit about this. And I think you're absolutely right. Is that the state, whether it's the state governments or the federal government, simply do not have power in huge swathes of the country. So effectively, it's the gang themselves that are offering protection to licit and illicit. I mean, the problem is they're moving on. They're not only protecting the drug dealers and the human traffickers, they're also protecting, the taco shop owner, right? They're offering, they've kind of privatized the proffering of protection, not dissimilar to the mafia did in 19th century Sicily or the Russian mafia did in 1990s Russia. I mean, it's a strange transition to that position. But that's effectively what they're doing. So they're almost cannibalizing the kind of licit bit of the state, right? So the state, I mean, if you go I'm sure you probably talk to people like this, but if you talk to merchants who are working in like Morelia, they won't pay tax because the state's not protecting them. They have to pay 30% of their funds protection to the, whatever, the Viagras or the Cartel Jalisco. So it's cutting into the state's ability even to collect tax now. I mean, I can't remember that. I think there was a group of Jalisco businessmen who basically put to the governor that they were not going to pay taxes anymore because they weren't protected from the extortion.
Yes, that is true. Yeah, that did happen, and in my own sort of patch of San Luis Potosí, it's very notable. It works two ways. Organized crime forces smallholders or taquerias or whatever to distribute cocaine, whether they like it or not. That they're obliged to do that. And secondly, they're obliged to pay a form of tax as well. And really, I mean, you have a state governor who's anyway a narcotraficante and has actually been served time a year or so in jail for that. So it really does make one feel what is happening to the power structure in the country, and it's disintegrating.
Yeah, no, I mean it is pretty distressing. I mean, I've told this to other people on this panel, but I deal a lot with people fleeing, refugees fleeing. I do expert witness accounts for them fleeing the violence, particularly. Well, it used to be always Guerrero, Michoacan, places you might expect Sinaloa, but now it's San Luis Potosí and Guanajuato and Morelos, places that have no intrinsic kind of value themselves in terms of a kind of drug route or drug going place. They're simply places that are being, and these people are not in any way involved in the illicit economy. They're simply people being shaken down for protection money, basically. It's incredibly depressing.
I'm going to have to go shortly, Ben, but I'd just like to thank you very much indeed for a fascinating presentation and to all the contributors. So when I disappear, it's not that I'm not enjoying it. I had a prior commitment, but thanks very much indeed.
Cheers, Dudley.
Cheers.
Thanks, Dudley. Can I ask a question about, I mean, moving from the present day, the really important stuff, to kind of detailed historical methodological stuff. I'm just interested, I mean, how easy is it to know, because I mean, crucial to your argument is that the money, tracing the money, and that it goes to kind of positive state building ends. I mean, how easy is it to tell that? Do you just sort of look at the budgets and you think, well, there's no way that money's come from anywhere else? Or I mean, how can we trace that? If somebody wanted to delve more into this and look at case studies, find more cantus, how would you go about doing that?
Well, part of the way is to actually, the American agents who went to Sinaloa and Chihuahua and Durango in the 1930s, 1940s, they traced the money because they basically found the state policeman who was in charge of who went to the actual dealers and basically shook them down for money. But then he admitted to them that he was giving this money to the state tax collectors, and they saw him hand this money over to the state tax collectors, right? So I mean, so that kind of indicated to me this was what was happening. Beyond that, I confess that yes, a lot of the stuff is looking at municipal and state budgets and just not having a clue. I mean, there's no indication there is some kind of other commodity boom happening. So the example I give, I think, in the book is a place called Mocorito, which struggled to pay for one single teacher in the 1930s. By the mid-1940s, was ringing in 80,000 pesos a year, and it was spending a quarter on policemen. It didn't even have a policeman beforehand. It was also the center of the drug racket. It was the main train station to deliver the stuff up north. Now, I mean, and I went through, I also went through some really boring kind of statistical analysis of kind of, agricultural production in the area. And there was just no indication where this money was coming from if it wasn't coming from drugs. So it could have been, I suppose, a very benevolent merchant, perhaps. But but you're right. A lot of it, some of it, I think you have to do is inference, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
And if you could, I mean, there are only very, and it's something I think we might have a challenge on. Only very, very rarely. Mexico does not really have a tradition of whistleblowers. And policemen will rarely say, I shook down. I mean, that extraordinary quote by Calderoni is still kind of blows my mind, right? I mean, this is the policeman saying that effectively I had to do this. I shook down some drug dealers to take out others for the gringos, basically. Yeah. But then he was shot. I mean, you don't get these people don't confess this kind of stuff easily. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, impunity is really revoked.
We have time for one or two more questions if people wanted to do that.
Make them really difficult, so I can really struggle, because there's nothing I like more than really difficult political science questions at 6:30.
Okay, so Mikhail Jimenez, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks for the conversation, Benjamin. It's a pleasure to hear you. I was wondering if you are having a look also at other sources, because you mentioned the role that the drug trafficking and the militarization of some regions played during the Dirty War. And I think from the 60s, there are different documents, mainly from groups on the left, some guerrilla movements, but more contemporary groups also, like the organizations of relatives of disappeared, who have also pointed out this two-sided state, or this genus state, when they accuse the particularly drug traffickers to be providing information for the state about movements of local groups, but also being the expression of violence against those groups, like doing the dirty, violent work that maybe the army or the government or the local police cannot do. So in impunity, obviously. So I think there are other sources maybe that can provide this sort of diagnostics from the early 60s even. Social movements that have pointed out the interplay between impunity and violence, which I think is quite original in your work. So I wonder if you are looking also at those sources, because and maybe if you can expand a little bit on that relationship between impunity and force, or impunity and violence and power, because normally the state is defined as a concentration of power, but you are trying to maybe uncover impunity as another form of violence, maybe another form of power. Thank you.
That's a really good point. I mean, my kind of crass economistic vision of impunity sees it as effectively currency, right? But I think seeing it as a form of power or a form of violence in itself is really interesting. So I think I'm going to have to kind of think about that much more. In terms of other examples, you are absolutely spot on. I mean, the two people who are doing the really, or three people really are doing really amazing work on this. One is Sergio Aguayo, who's really traced out how in Guadalajara, the DFS basically uses these right-wing groups who are involved in mostly the weed trade to go after the Liga 23 de Septiembre, which kidnaps the US consul in 1973, causes a load of embarrassment. So basically the DFS descends on Guadalajara, and according to a state cop, I think the quote is, they don't know shit about what's going on. So they effectively just go approach all the local drug dealers, the local thugs, and they basically give them a DFS badge and let them get up to what they want, as long as they go after the Liga 23 de Septiembre. It's also happened, so the example I gave was Guerrero, which has been studied really well by Alex Aviña. It's also happening up in the Golden Triangle, not quite so much in Sinaloa, because it doesn't have a large kind of left-wing movement up in the mountains, but particularly in Chihuahua, where there is a kind of a left-wing movement linked to the Tarahumara, and there the military do seem to employ drug traffickers to go after kind of Tarahumara radicals and school teachers that support them. So there are certain areas where they do this. Where I think there is a danger is as follows. I see the link between traffickers and Cold War repression as not. I think there is a tendency to see these two groups, state torturers and drug traffickers, as evil people, and hence they meet in the same spaces, right? They come together because they are both morally repellent human beings. I think there's a tendency to see that. I hope that my argument, what it shows you is this is really pragmatic. This is an exchange of interests, right? This is an exchange of impunity for coercion. That this is not simply they're both, they're nasty capitalists or whatever. They might be as well, but I don't think there's. I'm not sure that. I think there is a very pragmatic relationship between them.
Bill, did you want to come in again?
Yeah, just briefly. Sorry, I've moved to a quieter room. One of the other things I really liked about this was in the first half of the talk, you implied, I think maybe without saying it explicitly, that you can't look at corruption in a vacuum. And this is something that's bothered me about a lot of the analysis and coverage of Latin America in the last 20 years. It's the classic kind of economist line that, if you just sort out corruption, Latin America will unlock its potential. And I think this is also true of lots of other things, by the way, violence, drugs, the things that are often taken in isolation. Did you find it easy to integrate these methods from social science to kind of show that that's what I associate with social science, narrow problem solving of one variable isn't actually that useful?
I mean, I think you're really true, and corruption's a really good example of this. I mean, fortuitously, I'm very lucky. I'm in a department with a guy called Mark Knight, who has just produced a history of British corruption in the early modern period, which sounds like the kind of thing that I probably don't want to read, but it's actually really good, and it's really infused with what I didn't know about, which is a whole literature, mostly from people critiquing development economics, mostly coming out of Africa, explaining that corruption on a kind of local level, I mean, that we've got to see it in a much more subjective terms. That effectively, Africans see a lot of what we deem corruption, or at least development economists deem corruption as basically gift giving, right? Effectively exchanges which smooth out personal relations on which business are built, right? But this doesn't mean that you can just, I don't know, give vast gifts of from the public purse, right? I mean, Africans as well know what they know. It's a bit like pornography. They know corruption when they see it, right? So I think, so your question was how do I integrate kind of these critiques of social science into a kind of a bigger whole? I don't know, with difficulty. That's why the first bit was quite boring.
I'd muted them, but I laughed heartily. It wasn't.
But yeah, no, I mean, it is something I'm really interested in. I mean, this is something that Alan's dealt with a little bit. Claudio Lomnitz has dealt with a little bit, but I actually don't. I always think, I don't know, people, you know, I mean, I don't think I'm alone here in this group of 10 of us to think that a lot of the stuff I'm saying, do you know what? I found out that Alan said that Charles Tilley was the best person to understand Mexico with. And then he just he said it in one footnote or something, or like one page, and then just drops it for some insane reason. Anyway, but he also, his article on corruption is brilliant.
Yeah.
On basically the state. I mean, he's saying what, you know, African anthropologists are now saying 20 years afterwards. That there is a kind of that a lot of corruption has kind of state building potential, really.
Yeah, they just got quite low. They've got quite those, you know, less complimentary.
Okay, so well, maybe that's I think a good time to draw things to a close. Thank you very much, Ben, for a really stimulating talk and a really interesting discussion afterwards. So if everyone wants to unmute themselves and join me in thanking Ben in the traditional way, that would be great.
Oh God, right. I thought it was a kind of weird tradition you have at UCL, but no, it's just pretty normal.
No, this is just the normal.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.